When a routine first-class flight turns into a tense standoff, Melania Trump faces cryptic messages, veiled threats, and a shocking confrontation with a flight attendant. What starts as subtle hostility spirals into a revelation that will leave you stunned. What could Melania have done to provoke such unexpected anger? The airplane hummed steadily at 35,000 feet, the soft glow of the first-class cabin casting long shadows across its leather seats. Melania Trump sat by the window, her posture composed, though her mind was anything but. The clouds outside blurred into streaks of white, a reflection of her scattered thoughts. This was no ordinary flight, and she knew that before she boarded. Her mission was personal, yet its consequences could ripple far beyond her. Even in the safety of her secluded seat, she could feel eyes on her. Recognition was a curse she had grown used to. The murmurs, the stolen glances, none of it was new. Adjusting the silk scarf draped around her neck, she attempted to shrink into her seat, an almost futile attempt to escape the ever-watchful public eye. The flight attendant approached, her steps precise, her red uniform impeccable. The name tag read, Sophie, though the rigid smile she offered betrayed no warmth. Sophie leaned slightly forward, her voice smooth but oddly clipped. "Good evening, Mrs. Trump. Can I get you anything to drink?" Melania looked up, her face unreadable. "Water, please," she replied simply. As Sophie turned to leave, Melania's eyes followed her, noting the stiffness in her movements, the quick flicker of something behind her carefully maintained facade. It wasn't unusual for flight attendants to act overly formal around her. Still, something about Sophie's demeanor made her pause. The glass of water arrived moments later, placed delicately on the tray table. Yet Melania couldn't miss the slight tremor in Sophie's hand. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, an exchange that spoke volumes. Melania sensed it then. This woman knew something, carried something. It was more than just the typical nervousness of serving a high-profile passenger. It was personal. "Thank you," Melania said, her voice steady but observing. "You're welcome," Sophie replied, her tone polite yet lacking the sincerity one might expect. She lingered a moment longer than necessary before walking away, her back straight, her shoulders tight. Melania exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting back to the clouds. She didn't like the feeling that crept up her spine, the quiet unease that had taken root since she boarded. Something was off, but she couldn't place it, yet. A sudden faint sound snapped her focus, a tray clattering just a few rows behind her. Turning slightly, she noticed Sophie speaking to another flight attendant, her gestures subtle but tense. For a brief moment, their eyes darted toward Melania before quickly looking away. A whisper exchanged, a nod of agreement, and then Sophie disappeared toward the galley. Melania's fingers tightened around the armrest. She had navigated countless social minefields where smiles hid daggers and silence screamed louder than words. This felt eerily similar, though the setting was vastly different. Moments later, Sophie returned, this time with a tray of napkins. She placed them on Melania's tray table, the motion brisk, almost careless. The glass of water wobbled precariously, a few drops splashing onto Melania's hand. "Oh, I apologize," Sophie said, though her tone lacked the contrition her words implied. The faintest smirk ghosted her lips before vanishing as quickly as it came. Melania dabbed her hand with a napkin, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up at Sophie, her expression neutral but her eyes piercing. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge that hinted at her unease. Sophie froze momentarily, then forced a smile. "Of course, Mrs. Trump. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." As Sophie walked away, Melania's eyes lingered on her retreating figure. Her instincts told her there was more to this interaction than a clumsy slip. A low murmur from the other passengers drew her attention, confirming her suspicion that she wasn't imagining things. Sophie had caught their attention too. The air in the cabin grew heavier, the hum of the engines doing little to mask the growing tension. Melania's hand brushed against her handbag, a subconscious act of reassurance. Whatever was happening, she would find out soon enough. She always did. But as the minutes ticked by, Melania couldn't shake the feeling that this flight, so ordinary on the surface, was about to take a turn she hadn't anticipated. And for the first time in a long while she felt a flicker of vulnerability. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady but unable to drown out the uneasy rhythm of Melania's thoughts. She adjusted her scarf, glancing discreetly around the first-class section. Passengers seemed calm, engrossed in books, laptops, or idle conversations. Yet the tension surrounding Sophie, the flight attendant, clung to the air like static electricity. Melania leaned back, attempting to dismiss the strange exchange. But the whispers, the sidelong glances, and Sophie's deliberate movements had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Her instincts, sharp from years of maneuvering political and personal mazes, told her this wasn't over. Sophie returned, this time with the in-flight menu. She placed it in front of Melania with a practiced smile, though her eyes carried the faintest flicker of something darker. "The chef recommends the sea bass," she said, her tone smooth but laced with an undertone that was impossible to ignore. "But I imagine someone like you has a more refined palate." Melania's lips pressed into a thin line. She accepted the menu without comment, her gaze holding Sophie's for just a moment longer than necessary. Years of public life had taught her the power of silence. It often disarmed those looking for a reaction. Sophie lingered, as if waiting for a response before finally walking away. Melania opened the menu but didn't read a word. Her thoughts churned, trying to piece together the fragments of this peculiar situation. Was Sophie's behavior born out of personal animosity, or was something larger at play? The answer seemed to hover just out of reach. A soft clatter broke her focus. Melania glanced up to see Sophie accidentally tipping a tray of drinks onto the aisle carpet, the liquid pooling dangerously close to Melania's seat. The passengers nearby exchanged puzzled looks, their murmurs rising like a low tide. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Sophie said, her voice loud enough to draw attention. She grabbed a towel, bending to clean the mess, but her movements were unhurried, almost calculated. Her eyes darted toward Melania, narrowing briefly before she looked away. "Accidents happen," Melania said, her tone cool but deliberate. Her eyes stayed on Sophie, searching for cracks in her facade. Sophie straightened, her expression neutral, though her hands betrayed her. They trembled ever so slightly as she folded the towel. "Thank you for understanding, Mrs. Trump," she said, her voice now softer, almost mocking. She disappeared into the galley without another word. Melania exhaled, forcing herself to remain composed. Whatever Sophie's intentions, this was no random string of mishaps. Each action felt deliberate, as though Sophie was trying to provoke her, or send a message. A sudden buzz from Melania's phone drew her attention. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. The message was from an unknown number, the text short but chilling. "She knows. Be careful." Melania's pulse quickened. She looked around the cabin, scanning the faces of passengers, but none appeared out of the ordinary. Who sent the message? And what did Sophie know? Before she could dwell further, Sophie returned, her posture stiff, her gaze sharper than before. She set down Melania's dinner tray with more force than necessary, causing the utensils to rattle. As she turned to leave, Melania noticed a folded napkin tucked discreetly under the edge of the tray. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it free, unfolding it under the cover of her hand. The message, hastily scrawled, was chillingly direct. "You think you've escaped, but the past always catches up." Melania's breath hitched. The note felt like a phantom hand gripping her throat, squeezing tighter with each word. She folded the napkin quickly, her mind racing. Sophie wasn't just angry. This was personal. But how and why? Her gaze flicked toward Sophie, who stood at the far end of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones with another flight attendant. Their eyes darted toward Melania, and she knew, whatever this was, it wasn't over. And then, as if to confirm her suspicions, Sophie turned slightly, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. Melania clenched the napkin in her hand, her pulse quickening as the weight of Sophie's cryptic message settled over her. She glanced around the cabin, searching for any sign of who might have sent the earlier text. The passengers appeared oblivious, immersed in their own worlds, yet the tension lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Across the aisle, a man in a gray blazer shifted in his seat. His gaze lingered on Melania a fraction longer than was polite before he returned to his tablet. She couldn't shake the feeling that every move she made was being observed, dissected. Sophie reappeared, her expression unreadable as she busied herself near the galley. Melania studied her, the flight attendant's movements precise but unnaturally stiff, as though she was holding back something volatile. The soft ping of the seatbelt sign broke the silence, followed by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The announcement seemed routine, but Melania couldn't ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. Something about this flight felt far from routine. She turned her attention back to Sophie, who was now speaking in hushed tones with another flight attendant, her gestures sharp and urgent. Then it happened. Sophie approached, holding a tray of coffee. She stopped at Melania's seat, leaning slightly closer than necessary. "Peppermint tea," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought it might help. Settle your nerves." Melania didn't respond. Her eyes locked onto Sophie's, unflinching. "If there's something you want to say, just say it," she said, her voice calm but firm. Sophie's lips twitched, a faint smile playing at the edges. "Oh, there's plenty I could say," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper, "but I think you already know." Before Melania could press her further, Sophie straightened and placed the tray on a nearby surface. Her gaze lingered for a moment, heavy with unspoken meaning, before she walked away. The air in the cabin grew heavier, charged with a tension that even the other passengers couldn't ignore. Melania noticed the man in the gray blazer again, leaning into the aisle, his focus fixed not on her, but on Sophie. The way he watched her wasn't casual, it was calculated. Melania's unease deepened. Her fingers brushed against the folded napkin in her handbag, the ominous message echoing in her mind. She needed answers, but the pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and she didn't know where to start. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion at the front of the cabin. A passenger was raising his voice, gesturing toward a flight attendant who looked equally flustered. Sophie rushed to the scene, her presence immediately commanding attention. Melania watched intently, noting the stark contrast in Sophie's demeanor. She was calm, professional, every move exuding control. It was as if she had compartmentalized the earlier hostility, channeling her energy into diffusing the escalating argument. But as Sophie turned to calm the irate passenger, her gaze flickered toward Melania. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flash of something raw and unresolved. Melania's instincts screamed at her to act, to confront Sophie and demand answers. But then, her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Not everyone forgets, Mrs. Trump. Not everyone forgives." Melania's chest tightened. She turned her head slightly, scanning the cabin, but there was no indication of who had sent the message. Her gaze shifted back to Sophie, who was now heading toward the galley with hurried steps. And then she noticed something else, a man emerging from the economy section, his movements deliberate as he made his way toward first class. His eyes locked on Sophie, and for the briefest moment Melania thought she saw a flicker of recognition between them. Who was he? And what was his connection to Sophie? Melania's grip on the armrest tightened. Whatever was happening, she was no longer just an observer. She was in the center of something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Melania's mind raced as the man from economy class stepped into the first-class section. His gaze shifted briefly to her, then back to Sophie, who had retreated to the galley. The way he moved, calm but purposeful, set her nerves on edge. Whoever he wasn't just another passenger. Sophie emerged from the galley moments later, her composure intact, but her movements more deliberate than before. Her eyes met the man's, and for a split second, the tension between them was palpable. There was no mistaking it now. They knew each other, but what was their connection? Melania remained still, her years of public scrutiny teaching her how to observe without drawing attention. The cabin was quiet save for the hum of the engines, but beneath the surface the air crackled with an unspoken energy. Something was about to happen. The man approached Sophie, leaning in as if to speak discreetly. But even from her seat, Melania could see the rigid set of Sophie's shoulders, the way her jaw tightened as he whispered something. Whatever he said, it wasn't a casual exchange. Melania's fingers brushed against the napkin in her handbag, the ominous message etched into her memory. She glanced at her phone again, but there were no new messages. Whoever had sent the earlier texts was silent now, watching from the shadows. Sophie turned abruptly, walking toward Melania's seat. The man stayed back, his posture tense as he lingered near the galley. Sophie's expression was neutral, but her eyes carried a weight that made Melania's pulse quicken. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Trump?" Sophie asked. her voice steady but cold. Melania met her gaze, refusing to look away. "You tell me," she said evenly. "You seem to have something on your mind." For a moment, Sophie's mask slipped. Her eyes flashed with something raw, anger, maybe even pain, but she quickly composed herself. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "But some jobs are more complicated than others. Wouldn't you agree?" Melania's chest tightened, her instincts screaming that there was more to this than Sophie's cryptic remarks. Before she could respond, Sophie leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper. "It must be nice, though, not having to deal with the consequences of someone else's decisions." The words were like a slap, their meaning sharp and deliberate. Sophie straightened, giving a tight smile before walking away, leaving Melania to process the implications. Consequences. Decisions. The phrases rattled in her mind, drawing her back to her time in the White House. Policies, protests, scandals. It was all a blur of chaos and control. But Sophie wasn't talking about politics in general. This was personal. Melania's thoughts were interrupted by a low voice from behind her. "She's not wrong, you know." She turned sharply, startled to see the man from economy class now seated in the row behind her. His expression was calm but firm, his gaze steady. "Who are you?" Melania asked, her voice steady despite the tension clawing at her chest. "My name's Victor," he said simply, "and I'm here to make sure this doesn't get out of hand." "Get out of hand?" Melania echoed, her eyes narrowing. "What exactly is going on here?" Victor hesitated, glancing toward Sophie, who was now at the far end of the cabin, her back turned to them. "She's angry," he said, his voice low. "And she has every right to be. But this isn't the place for it." Melania's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? Angry about what?" Victor leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Her brother was deported during your husband's administration. She blames him for tearing her family apart, and by extension she blames you." The words hit Melania like a physical blow. Her breath caught, her thoughts racing. Memories of heated debates in the West Wing, protests outside the gates, and headlines screaming accusations flooded her mind. She had always been a quiet observer in those moments, the First Lady maintaining a polished facade. But now, she was the target. "She won't do anything drastic," Victor continued, his tone softer now. "But she wants you to know the pain she's been carrying." Melania's gaze shifted to Sophie, her figure still tense as she moved through the cabin. A pang of guilt coursed through her, though she kept her expression neutral. She didn't have control over immigration policies, she never did. But to Sophie, that distinction didn't matter. "What do you want me to do?" Melania asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor leaned back slightly, his eyes thoughtful. "Talk to her. Listen. That's all she wants." Melania hesitated, her instinct for self-preservation clashing with a growing sense of responsibility. She had spent years perfecting the art of silence, of staying out of conflicts that didn't directly involve her. But this time, silence wasn't an option. Melania's chest tightened as she rose from her seat, her mind swirling with questions and doubts. But one thing was clear. Avoiding Sophie wasn't an option anymore. If what Victor said was true, then this wasn't just about hostility. It was about pain, unresolved and deeply personal. The hum of the engine seemed louder as she approached the galley where Sophie was busy organizing trays. The other flight attendants glanced nervously at Melania before finding excuses to leave, sensing the tension between the two women. Sophie turned, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw Melania standing there. "Mrs. Trump," Sophie said, her voice sharp but controlled. "Is there something you need?" "Yes," Melania replied calmly. "I need to talk to you." Sophie's hand stilled, her expression hardening. "About what?" "About your brother," Melania said, her voice soft but firm. "And about what you've been carrying all this time." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment Sophie seemed caught off guard, her composure cracking just enough for Melania to see the raw emotion beneath. Then Sophie straightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "Carrying," Sophie repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You have no idea what I've been carrying." "You're right," Melania admitted. "I don't, but I want to understand." Sophie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Understand? You want to understand? Do you know what it's like to watch your family be torn apart? To see the people you love treated like they don't matter because of some policy that people like you could have stopped? Melania's throat tightened, but she held Sophie's gaze. I didn't have the power to make those decisions, she said quietly, but I understand how it feels to be judged for things I couldn't control. Sophie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her anger giving way to something closer to grief. He was a good man, she said, her voice trembling. He worked hard. He paid his taxes, and they sent him away like he was nothing. My mother died a year later, and I had to bury her alone because I couldn't even get him back for the funeral. Melania's heart ached at the pain in Sophie's voice. I'm sorry, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I truly am. I can't bring him back or undo what happened, but I want you to know that I hear you. Your brother's story, it matters. Sophie looked away, her jaw tight. Words don't change anything. No, they don't, Melania agreed. But actions can. Sophie's gaze snapped back to Melania, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her grief. What kind of actions? Melania hesitated for a moment, then said, Tell me his story. All of it. Let me take it to the people who can do something about it. I can't promise change, but I can promise that his name won't be forgotten. The cabin felt still, as though the weight of the conversation had quieted even the hum of the engines. Sophie studied Melania, her anger giving way to cautious hope. Why would you do that? Sophie asked, her voice softer now. Because it's the right thing to do, Melania replied simply, and because I've spent too long letting silence define me. For a long moment neither woman spoke, then Sophie nodded, her shoulders relaxing for the first time. Okay, she said quietly. I'll tell you. As Sophie began to speak, Melania listened intently, her heart heavy but resolute. She knew this conversation wouldn't erase the past, but it was a start, a small step toward healing wounds that had festered for too long. When the plane landed, Sophie avoided eye contact with Melania as the passengers disembarked. But as Melania reached the exit, Sophie hesitated. Thank you, she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the noise of the cabin. Melania paused, offering a small, genuine smile. Take care of yourself, she replied. As she stepped off the plane, Melania felt a strange sense of clarity. The flight had been more than a journey from one city to another. It had been a reckoning, a reminder of the power of compassion in the face of anger. If you enjoyed this thought-provoking story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Sometimes the smallest acts of understanding can create ripples of change. Stay tuned for more captivating stories that inspire, engage, and challenge perspectives. See you in the next one.